Thank you for joining us. My name is Jacob, and I will be the operator for today's presentation. Before we get started, I would like to acquaint you with a few features of this web event technology. At any time, you may adjust your audio using your computer's volume settings. There will be a question and answer portion of the webinar. To submit a question, just click the Q&A icon on the bottom of the toolbar on the Zoom platform and enter your question. Feel free to enter questions for the presenters at any time during the presentation. Please note that today's presentation is being recorded and both the recording and slides will be emailed to you. We are joined today by Chris Lowney, Vice Chair of the Board of Trustees for Common Spirit Health, who will be our moderator for today's discussion. At this time, I would like to turn the presentation over to Chris for opening remarks. The floor is yours, Chris.
Thank you, Jacob, and thank you, friends and colleagues, for joining us for the Elderly, Our Future. I'm delighted to moderate this first of what will be 4 webinars, and this is a wonderful partnership, co-sponsorship of the Catholic Health Association, the Community of Sant'Egidio, Catholic Charities USA, and importantly, all of you who are with us today. And my job is to get us through a rich agenda, but a tightly packed one in exactly 1 hour. So I'll make my own 4 context setting points very brief. First, there are millions and millions of elderly, but this program is not about someone else. It's about us. It's about all of us. We're either elderly or will become elderly. We're either caregivers or will be caregivers or will need care. And we're talking about our brothers and sisters, our neighbors, our family members, and so on. So please keep that in mind. This is about us, not someone else. Second context setting point, our series is occasioned by the pandemic, but it's not about the pandemic. The pandemic, of course, has shone a really harsh light on some realities that have been challenges in our society long before the pandemic began, and challenges that will only become worse and more difficult as we enter into whatever the new normal is like. And so we want to keep our focus not just on what we might be doing differently now during the pandemic, but importantly, how we want to change society and change the world going forward over the long term. Third context point, I say how we will change the world. This series is about trying to catalyze a change of culture, change of mindset, change of behaviors, and to do so across American society and indeed across the world. There are only about 200 of us on this webinar today, but let me remind you that far fewer than 200 people have in the past, notably in Christian culture, managed to change human society. So, as we go through this, I'd like to encourage all of us to remain focused on our own agency. In other words, we're not going to be talking really about tax policy, regulation, politics, institutions. We want to try to keep a focus on mindset and on what we can do. And last context setting point, we want to have an ongoing conversation during these seminars, but also outside these seminars. So as ideas are inspired by what you hear or say, feel free to put them in the chat box, put your questions in the Q&A box, and importantly, take the conversation outside of our cyber walls here. Please use your own social media. We're using hashtags that are at the top of the chat box when you came in today. Hashtags like hashtag elders, hashtag aging, hashtag number 4, letter R, elders, 4R elders, and hashtag Catholic care. So please tweet out your ideas, share your ideas, invite others to watch this recording afterward and to join us in the future. Now with that, before we go any further, let's do the most important thing, which is place ourselves in God's holy presence. And let's pray for the Spirit's inspiration and for God's Spirit to come powerfully into our midst. And Ms. Paola Piscitelli of the community of Sant'Egidio will lead us in prayer this morning. I will introduce her more fully when we get to the panelists. So for now, I'll invite Paola to turn on her camera and to lead us in prayer.
This is a prayer from Ephraim the Syrian, a theologian who lived in the 4th century and was already reflecting and praying with the elderly. So it's fitting for us to follow this long line of elders that during the century prayed God. Lord Jesus Christ, you have power over life and death. You know what is secret and hidden, and neither our thoughts nor our feelings are concealed from you. Cure me of my sins and of the evil I have done in my life. Now my life declines from day to day, and my sins increase. O Lord, God of souls and bodies, you know the frailty of my soul and my flesh. Grant me strength in my weakness and sustain me in my misery. Give me a grateful soul that I may never cease to recall your benefits. Be not mindful of my sins, but forgive me for all my betrayals. O Lord, disdain not my prayer. Sustain me in your grace until the end, and keep me as in the past, now and forever. Amen.
Amen. And thank you, Paola. As our first presentation this morning, we're lucky, and it's fitting to have remarks from Archbishop Vincenzo Paglia, who is the president of the Pontifical Academy for Life. And Archbishop Paglia may even be part of our participant group this evening. For him, that was his intention. But in terms of his presentation, we didn't want to run the risk of any bandwidth failure coming from Rome, Vatican City to us, and therefore he's taped his remarks. Many of us have been appalled and alarmed at what the pandemic has revealed about the sufferings, the reality of life for many of our elderly brothers and sisters, and all credit to the Archbishop and to the Academy and his colleagues for taking the reality of the pandemic as a point of departure, a catalyst for this document that really invites us, challenges us to think much more broadly about the elderly in our society. And so we will now hear the remarks of Archbishop Paglia.
La Pontificia Accademia per la Vita ha sentito la responsabilità di una riflessione sul mondo degli anziani. Cosa è accaduto? Durante il tempo della pandemia, gli anziani hanno pagato il prezzo più alto. Sono i numeri drammatici. Fino ad oggi, più di 2 milioni di persone anziane sono morte a causa del Covid. È evidente che è indispensabile cambiare il modo di assistere gli anziani, perché questa tragedia ha fatto venire alla luce le contraddizioni di una società che per un verso allunga gli anni della vita, quasi tutti vivremo 20-30 anni in più, ma per l'altro verso non sa né come spenderli né come accompagnarli. Di qui l'incapacità a aiutarli in un momento come questo della pandemia. È indispensabile ripensare in maniera globale il modo con cui la società accompagna i più anziani, uomini e donne di 70, 80, 90 anni, a vivere con maggiore serenità l'ultimo tratto della loro vita. In questo senso, il documento che la Pontificia Accademia per la Vita ha emanato, che non a caso si intitola La vecchiaia, il nostro futuro, vuole indicare che questo tempo non è un tempo da scartare, non è un tempo da mettere da parte, è un tempo preziosissimo per tutti. In questo dobbiamo dire che la prospettiva che Papa Francesco continua a ripetere, ossia di abbattere quella cultura dello scarto per promuovere una cultura di prossimità agli anziani, è quantomeno provvidenziale. Io credo che sia indispensabile, anzitutto, comprendere che gli anziani vanno accompagnati a casa loro, dove sempre hanno vissuto. C'è un diritto a continuare a vivere dove per tanti decenni abbiamo vissuto, o comunque nell'habitat, nell'ambiente dove sempre siamo stati, perché sradicare un anziano dal suo ambiente significa uccidere la memoria. È come sradicare un albero e piantarlo in un terreno non suo. Di qui allora l'intera società, a partire da chi ha la responsabilità politica di governo, deve elaborare un disegno, una visione che appunto preveda la compagnia, l'accompagnamento degli anziani in questi anni. Certamente, possibilmente facendoli restare a casa loro, oppure attivando co-housing, centri diurni, centri di riabilitazione, e poi semmai, qualora la non autosufficienza fosse grave, si possono portare in istituti appositi, ma sempre con l'obiettivo di tornare a casa per poter chiudere la propria vita circondata dai propri cari e dai propri amici. In questo senso, la Chiesa Cattolica ha una responsabilità particolare. Nella Bibbia gli anziani sono una grande benedizione. Gli anziani nella Bibbia spesso hanno salvato. Pensiamo a Noè. Noè era un anziano e in un momento come quello del diluvio, una sorta di pandemia gravissima, è stato lui a salvare gli uomini, le donne e anche gli animali, anche la natura. E Abramo a 75 anni inizia la sua avventura con Dio, per non parlare poi di Simeone ed Anna nel Nuovo Testamento, o anche di Nicodemo, o anche di Giuseppe d'Arimatea, che dona a Gesù il sepolcro nuovo. Voglio dire, cari amiche e cari amici, che la Chiesa Cattolica ha una sapienza straordinaria per poter ispirare anche la società civile a prendersi cura con maggiore saggezza degli anziani. Hanno una grande tradizione da trasmettere. Gli anziani sono la parte più avanzata, ma la cura per gli anziani è molto importante anche per i più giovani. Che tragedia sarebbe se i giovani vedono la società che scarta gli anziani. Come penseranno il loro futuro? Ecco perché semmai c'è da irrobustire e da riallacciare il dialogo tra giovani ed anziani per creare quella intergenerazionalità che aiuta l'intera società a vivere con maggiore speranza la propria esistenza. Io credo che gli Stati Uniti, questo grande paese che è all'apice del progresso, deve mostrare a tutti la sapienza di saper accompagnare i propri anziani in maniera serena nel loro ultimo tratto di vita. La scienza ci aiuta a vivere meglio, ma c'è bisogno di una sapienza e di una spiritualità perché questi anni siano di arricchimento e non di scarto, di insegnamento e non di abbandono.
Thank you, Archbishop Vincenzo. And let me continue to invite robust use of the chat box. I was struck by the phrase that we have science, but sometimes we need wisdom. And also the Archbishop in a way is giving a challenge to those of us on this call to try and help pioneer different ways, different modes of thinking and acting. Let's turn to the document itself. If you haven't read it, let me please commend it to you. It's easy to read, about 10 pages, and I personally found it very refreshing, more human than many things that sometimes come out of the Vatican, but don't say that I said that to anyone. To unpack the document for us, we're privileged to have Father Charlie Bouchard with us. He's a Dominican, and he's a senior director of theology and sponsorship within the Catholic Health Association. And many of us who are trustees of Catholic healthcare systems and organizations know Father Charlie well. He works a lot with us. He has a splendid background for what we've asked him to do for us today. As a former editor of Healthcare Ethics, a provincial of his own congregation, worked within Ascension Health, taught moral theology. He's coming to us today from his retreat, and therefore, if I remember it well, he's literally embodying one of the great mottos of his Dominican tradition, to contemplate and to share the fruits of contemplation with others. So Father Charlie will speak to us for about 12 minutes, and then we'll have 3 minutes for your questions and comments that'll be intermediated by my colleague Ben Wortham. So while you're listening to Charlie, please feel free to share questions in the question box or comments in the chat box or whatever you may wish. So let me now turn the microphone and video to Father Charlie Bouchard.
Thank you very much, Chris, for the introduction. My comments will be very brief, as you indicated, and I'm not going to go through the document line by line, but just highlight some of the things that really struck me as important. It is also a great thing that I believe that we are collaborating with Sant'Egidio and with Catholic Charities to offer this, because you know, we often talk about collaboration, but it doesn't happen as easily as we talk about it. So let me, if we begin with the first slide here, these would be the key things that I think are important in this document. One of them, as the Archbishop already indicated, is that the lessons we have learned from COVID are really not new. We've been aware of many of these things for a long time, but COVID placed them in high relief. I mean, almost in a shocking way. The document also highlights the importance of community, solidarity, family and friendship, and especially for the elderly, and how our need for that changes as we grow older. I think there are many indications and suggestions in the document of ways in which our culture works against these things, these values that we all need. And particularly important to me was the document's emphasis on the need for solidarity between the elderly and the young, bringing them together. The next slide just gives, if you look through the footnotes of the document, you'll see many of the sources of it. And it draws heavily on the writings of Pope Francis, especially Humana Communitatis, which is from January 2019, Fratelli Tutti, which obviously is based heavily on solidarity, and then a letter that he wrote while he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires, which is Only Love Can Save Us. It also draws on a prayer of his from 2020 and a letter entitled In Loneliness, the Coronavirus Kills More, which we certainly witnessed firsthand. Uh, in terms of some of the specific ideas in this document, one of the things that struck me was its admonition that we need to create a new space for the elderly. And this doesn't just mean a physical space, although that's certainly part of it, but I think also a new clinical space and a new political space for the elderly. We need to open the windows or open the drapes on the problems that we're facing and look at the many different ways that we have to address that. We also need, it says, to become close to the elderly. And I think this is a reflection of Pope Francis's frequent use of the idea of encounter, real encounter with the elderly. And I think probably encounter with our own aging as well. And one of the big obstacles that we face is that our culture does not encourage that. We have a distance between ourselves and the elderly in what the document describes as a throwaway culture. It's also important, the document says, to remember that individuals age differently and have different stories, and that we need living situations that are not hospitals, but homes. And for all of those of you who are in senior care, you know that, at least until very recently, there has not only been a prevalence, an inappropriate prevalence of the acute care model for senior care, but that there has also been a lot of difficulty with the transition or the relationship between acute and long-term care. So we've got really two different problems. The next slide highlights that encounter between the young and the old, the past and the future. And when the document used this beautiful image of the presentation, I had never really thought about that as an intergenerational encounter, but it really is. And it's a beautiful image for exactly what we're talking about here, transitioning from the past into the future and from our youth into age. The next slide highlights that with another illustration here, a little more unusual from the cultural standpoint. And it talks about how hope springs from the encounter between two fragile people, a child and an elderly person. And it reminds us that the Lord works in the lives of both of those groups of people. The document also suggests repeatedly that we have to develop a new paradigm for the care of seniors. It has to be imaginative and adaptive, eliminate barriers, beginning with architectural ones, but not stopping there. It has to see caregivers in a different light, and it draws attention to the possibilities for technology that will allow the elderly to stay in their homes longer and to help facilitate a more integrated system of care. And it mentions again this notion of personalization, which takes account of the fact that the elderly have different stories, they have different needs as they age, and that they need different kinds of care, that it is definitely not a one-size-fits-all. One of the things that occurred to me as I read this document, particularly as it talked about the privileges and blessings of age, is this book by Richard Rohr, which many of you are probably familiar with. In this book, which I read not long after it came out about 10 years ago, as I myself was beginning to think about old age, talks about the two halves of life. And it says that the first half is the early stage of religion, as it says, which prepares us for the experience of God yet to come. Rohr says that it's marked by either or categories, and that it is very much involved with establishing boundaries, career, and routine, which is what young people do. They're building things up. But then the second half of life is really about acceptance of mortality, experiencing suffering, venturing outside our comfort zone. And rather than being either or, it is more both and. And I thought of this book repeatedly as I read through the document. So I just wanted to mention it to you here as a possible resource. it is important, kind of following Richard Rohr's thing, to realize the document tells us that the elderly have grown in faith and wisdom, which the next generation needs. And this made me think of the many people, young people I've talked to, who spoke about the importance of their grandparents in their lives. And again, in a thing that was very striking to me, the document says we need to evangelize the elderly for this moment in life as they age, and that the elderly in turn must evangelize us, especially the young. And this quote from John Paul II, his letter to the elderly, I thought was a very powerful statement, that we must help the elderly to be actors in the new evangelization to transmit the gospel themselves. And I think it's a really dramatic challenge to those of us who are growing older to say, you have a special task of evangelization at this point in your life. There is also this prophetic role of the elderly, which again, I found very important. We have to not only revive hope in them, but also give younger generations the lifeblood which springs from the dreams of the elderly, these irreplaceable vehicles for memory to wisely guide the future. And he says that the document says that if we operate out of this throwaway culture mentality, we deprive the elderly of their prophetic role and instead set them aside for purely productive reasons. In other words, when you can no longer do anything worthwhile, then we don't have any need for you. But this prophetic role is something which should grow and expand as we grow older. Part of that call to be evangelizers and to help the young see the world and life and its challenges in a different way. So I will conclude there. That may offer you some thoughts that you did not already have, but I think this is a fitting conclusion here from the prophet Joel. Your elders will dream and your young people will have visions. I always thought of those two as unrelated things. This document helped me see that they're two sides of the same coin.
Thank you, Father Charlie. That was a wonderful précis, and I think really helps us to think and focus on what we've being challenged by in this document. And the good news is that I've so freaked us out about time that we're actually a couple of minutes ahead of time, which is wonderful. So it gives us, therefore, another couple of minutes for what's as important, more important than anything else. How do we as a community begin to receive this, think about this, ask about this? I'm going to ask my colleague, Ben Wortham, to turn on his camera and microphone. He's going to help us by mediating questions. Our first thought was it would be wonderful to have each person speak in their own voice, but with this large webinar, it just seemed impractical. So Ben, he's the first of all, the VP for Behavioral Health Integration at Catholic Charities USA. That means he helps give support to the various Catholic charities offices around the country for counseling and case management services and so on. And he's been a core collaborator partner in helping to put this seminar together. He's been monitoring the chat box and the Q&A box. And therefore, I might ask him now, Ben, is there any either theme or kind of comment that's coming up that you want to share with the whole group, or are there specific questions for Father Charlie that you might put to him now? And we'll have a few minutes of Q&A with Father Charlie, and then we'll move on to three panelists to give their own reactions to the document. So Ben, please share any comment or question that's striking you from what you've been following.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Chris and Father Charlie. Yeah, we had some comments come through, and let me read one of them that stuck out. And it was actually a question, and it was, how familiar do we think that Catholics in the USA are with the many examples of elderly in the Bible mentioned by Archbishop Paglia? Is there a need opportunity to learn together with the Church and Pope Francis?
Well, I would say from my perspective, definitely. As I said, even that that presentation story was one I had never thought about that as intergenerational. And there are lots of examples in the Old Testament about aging, and I don't think we have given them a lot of thought. I don't think we've allowed the elderly, much less all the rest of us, to avail themselves of those scriptural images and stories.
And then here's another one kind of drawing on that same theme. And this was in the comment box too. Our culture is so anti-aging and anti-death. The young are hesitant to encounter the old because it reminds them of their own mortality, frailty, and future weakness. How do we change this story and draw in the young? Once they are there, I agree that the blessings and benefits are enormous. Getting them there is maybe one of our challenges.
Yeah, you know, I think for myself, as I was reflecting on this, it occurred to me that, you know, children, young children, don't have any hang up about the old. I mean, they enjoy them in a way that sometimes older people don't. And I think when we get older ourselves, we grow into young adulthood, maybe we don't pay as much attention or aren't as open to the experience and the wisdom of the elderly as children are, you know, young children. So I'm not sure what that says, but it's just something that occurred to me.
And then I'll do one more that just came through. Can we identify the existing best practices in the light of this document across the world that are applicable to our culture and how we educate everyone about it?
Yes, I think that's one of our primary responsibilities. You know, there are elder care services and residences that are doing an excellent job. And we need to take a close look at them and say, what are they doing right that we can replicate? Because this is going to be an inductive learning process for us. We haven't really done this before, partly because people are living much longer and partly because we just didn't pay attention to the problems out there. We ignored them, you know, as the document said. So, and I think that Catholic healthcare has a real role in making this happen. You know, many of you are aware that I've been critical of the fact that many of our systems have given up senior care and continue to do so. And that's how I really got into this. I work with sponsors, and I've been trying to talk to sponsors about this and say, is this really the time for us to get out of long-term and senior care? Rather, shouldn't we look at what we're doing and say, yes, society needs this from us as a gospel ministry?
Thank you. And then, this will be, I think, one more here, kind of on the same thing, but kind of a comment too with the question. And it's, when is someone elderly? I started Social Security last year, so I'm in the category of elderly, even though many of our residents are up to over 100 years old. How do we stop creating categories?
Well, that's right. I think one of the points of the document is this personalization, you know, that people age differently. And also, you know, our age, life expectancy has increased dramatically just in the last century. There was an article in the paper just yesterday about overachieving seniors, one of whom I think was 92 and he's still working full time. You know, that would have been unthinkable not that many years ago. So you're right. We should be very careful about categorizing and using labels because getting old ain't what it used to be, in a good sense.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Father Charlie. Please stick around, and thank you, Ben, for doing a great job. And it's really wonderful to see such a rich and provocative array of questions coming in front of us and comments. That's exactly what we hoped for. Let me invite the three panelists to turn on their cameras. Before I introduce them, maybe I'll make one bridging comment based on something that Ben brought up and that I saw in the chat box. So there was a comment, how can we identify best practices? There was a comment, how can we connect elderly with their communities, their loved ones, and so on. And, you know, the document or no document is really the playbook. It kind of puts its finger on a challenge and a vision, but in terms of how we get from here to there, that is kind of falling back onto us a little bit. And in a way, part of our rationale for this webinar series was to try to give voice for some of the great ideas that are already in effect all over the country. And let me remind you that our last couple of sessions in this series, we want to use to highlight new models, new ideas, new approaches that you all are already undertaking that others might easily replicate. So please send an email to one of us in the sponsor group if you think you have a really good practice that should be shared and that you might want to share, and we'll select a handful of those to profile. Okay, now let me introduce our three panelists and then put a question or two to them, and those of you who are with us will also have a chance to put questions to them. So I'll introduce all three. We have Julie Trocho, who is the Senior Director of Community Benefit and Continuing Care at the Catholic Health Association. She's based in the DC office there, and she's previously served at the American Healthcare Association. She's been a public health nurse. She's been a staff nurse at a hospital nursing home complex, so she brings great experience to this panel. Monsignor Michael Boland is recently moved to the DC area from Chicagoland. So he's a missionary right now in the DC area. And he is at the moment executive consultant to Catholic Charities Catholic USA, especially on immigration and refugee services issues. So this is an important moment in the United States for what he does. He would be known to many of you for his decades leading Catholic Charities Chicago, which at least at the time, I believe still now, is the largest Catholic Charities organization in the United States with some 150 programs, including important outreach to elderly people with disabilities and so on. And our third panelist is Paola Piscitelli, who is the president of the community of Sant'Egidio in the United States. Sant'Egidio has presence in multiple cities in the United States right now. If you're not familiar with them, I invite you please to go to their website, learn more. You may want to join lots of on-the-ground work with with elderly communities, with people who are living on the streets, with those who are immigrants and trying to learn our languages in the United States and so on. The most elegant thing I could say about Paola is that she walks the talk. I'm privileged to join her on Tuesday evenings for food distribution. And yesterday, Sunday, my wife and I happened to be walking in a park, and we saw Paola. We ran into Paola by great coincidence, serving some street folks who were living in that community. Okay, so let's begin to speak with these three panelists of ours. And for a first question, I'm going to give them each about a minute. And let me ask each of them this. What's one engagement, initiative, project that your ministry has with elders that you're particularly proud of? And if folks watching us want to connect with that ministry, what could they do? So why don't we start with Julie and then hear from Monsignor Boland, then hear from Paola, and then I'll ask a second question of our panelists.
Thanks very much, Chris, and hello, everybody. And it was wonderful to see so many familiar names. Welcome. CHA is a national organization of Catholic-sponsored healthcare organizations, and our members serve older people in hospitals and nursing homes, in senior housing, in hospice, and lots of other settings. So this document was really important to us. I think the one issue that I might point out, because I think CHA and our members serve elders in so many ways, But in recent years, we've been involved in something called age-friendly healthcare. And that is where we're trying to close that gap between what the research tells us to do and what we actually do in our practice, especially in terms of medication, making sure older people get the right medication and don't get the wrong medication, in mobility, that they're physically active, that we pay attention to people with some dementia. And most of all, that we focus our care on what matters to older people, that they are the central focus of our attention. So I think what we're doing in age-friendly healthcare is one of the things that I'd point out, Chris.
Thank you. Monsignor Boland.
And thank you, Chris, and welcome to everyone. I do think that here at Catholic Charities USA, it is a member organization of about 167 Catholic Charities in the United States and the territories of the United States. And so there's a great effort of Catholic Charities, especially in the area of working with seniors in almost every diocese in the country. Probably one of the things that I think we're most proud of, and it's a lot of work that Ben has been involved with here at Catholic Charities USA, and a lot of us out in the field as well, has been in the area of healthy housing and looking at the housing for seniors, and the healthy part of looking at the total person and to see all the many ways that we could serve them. So it isn't just housing, it isn't just healthcare, it isn't just socialization or medication, but it's everything. And how do we do that? And how do we coordinate that? And that's one of the areas I believe in the future, especially about this document, that's so well articulated and that Father Charlie spoke about, was the great need for us to relook at how we do that and to try to be able to find new and different ways to try to be able to help our brothers and sisters who are elderly.
Thank you. Paula.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Chris. And it's very joyful to be here together. And I would like to speak of a project in the community in which we befriend elderly in a nursing home, and eventually we help them to return home, at least some of them. As a community, we were visiting some elderly at Cabrini in Manhattan, an institution that really encouraged also the return home of some residents. And by listening to their voices, we realized the deep longing they had from home. I met Camry, who was 97 years old. She was no more a sharecropper from Mississippi. She was no more the activist of civil rights movement, not anymore a Baptist preacher. She was just one number, one of the many, maybe one bed in a room of fours. And so Sant'Egidio acted as her surrogate family, and we helped her return home. Her home was poor, was small, but it was her home, the place where she lived for more than 50 years, of which she was proud, where people of the neighborhood knew her as grandma, and where everyone began to receive a blessing on a prayer. And Camry died at 103 in her bed at home, full of her days, as the Bible said. So this is one of the story of friendship with many elders that allowed me to meet them in their entirety. And if anybody wants to connect or to visit, just email me. That's so easy. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Okay, let me do one more quick round with our three panelists. This time, Monsignor Boland, I'll go to you first, then Paula, then Julie. And for the second round, let me ask you quickly to just share with us what was one thing that has really struck you, either from the Vatican document or what you've heard today? And what kind of change do we need to catalyze? And let me ask you to be mindful of time, because we also want to give a last chance for our attendees also to share their own questions. So Monsignor Boland, let me put that to you first. What was one thing that's really struck you about this document or the conversation today, and what kind of change do we need to catalyze?
One thing is that it brought to me, to my attention, was the need for creativity. You know, if the document really talks about maybe looking differently at the way we take care of the elderly, or different creative ways. And even though the document talked about like the great tradition in our church of religious communities and congregations that have such a deep connection to the elderly and have done so for so many years, to think about how do we do that? And at Catholic Charities, how do we do that for our seniors and in the community? And the ways that we might be able to do a better way of revisiting how we do that. I do think, like, in the importance is one of the challenges to me greatly in the area, which is a real issue, which I think all of us relate to, is the idea about the regulations that we all deal with in the elder care. So when we talk about, it's very challenging to try to create home environments, especially in some of our assisted living or in our skilled care or memory units, primarily because of the way the state is involved and how they measure everything and do all these things. It takes a lot of creativity to find ways that we as a people in the care of the elderly can really try to rise above that and try to make sure that all of our chapters in Chicago, we had many senior residents, a nursing home, rehab center, we had many apartments, and we were always trying to find ways that the seniors would be interacting with the community and interacting in ways that would enhance them, but also allow the people to share their wisdom and their guidance as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Paula, I'm going to come back to you. Same question.
I think that one of the things that struck me was that the elderly are really one of the signs of our time. In fact, when Monsignor Paglia said that all of us, as a fact, are mostly living longer, and this is on one hand is a gift, but on the other hand can see as something burdensome or useless. But I think that something that was important in the document that was to stress the strength that comes from the frailty and the weakness of the elderly. I think that the awareness of our fragility, of our vulnerability, of our dependence grows with age. But often these concepts are very much against the culture of our world. But I think that if we want to imagine a future, we need to think of a future together, and that dependence is essential to that. Pope Francis, during the pandemic, repeated many times that we cannot be saved alone. And I think that the elders are leading the way in this vision. I want to give a small example of the House of Sant'Egidio, in which this example of complementarity is very true. There are small family homes in which there are plenty of volunteers from all generations, and they embody this culture of solidarity. During the pandemic, there was no death, they were virus-free, but also they were able to prepare the food for the homeless in their neighborhood. And in a regular time we could call, they are providing language lesson to the children of immigrants. So I think that it's true. In a way, the elderly need help, as we heard, but also they give much in love, in friendship, in humanity. And I think that concretely, we need to give room to the elderly, to make them visible in our gatherings, in our families, in our parks, wherever it is. Because there is much joy in being together, and it's a good message. And also for the young people, I remember also some question before, I think it's good to see all of us together, because it's also reassuring for a future that is coming. So in terms of what we can do, I think two things. One, at a personal level, to befriend an elderly, just keep one man or an older woman or man close to you. It's very personal, it's very feasible. And second, act in every way creatively to find all ways we can to keep the elderly in their environment and not in large institutions. Thank you.
Julie, a quick answer or comment from you.
Thank you. And Paul, I love both of those things. Thank you so much. Well, Chris, the document gave us so many suggestions of things we should do, getting the old and the young together. It says, don't consider old age as a disease, but rather as a gift. But what struck me when I read it at the very beginning, when it says what we shouldn't do, it said we should not offer a chorus of praise for those who kept contagion from their facilities or scapegoat the blame. And I think before we move on to that new paradigm, we should do exactly that. I have been so impressed over this past year that that healthcare facilities and senior housing run by Catholic Charities and Catholic Health just did a Herculean job of taking care of older people and keeping them safe and taking care of them. We had administrators and staff who lived in the facility for months, or who camped out in the parking lot in their campers or their RVs, so they'd be right by there. And they did that without a whole lot of protective equipment and all. And I think we do have to praise them and recognize just a heroic job that they have done, and we owe them so much of our gratitude. But the other thing it said is don't point fingers. But I think we have to recognize that while right now we're so happy that the elderly are the first to be getting, at least in this country, first to be getting the vaccine, they were at the beginning the last people to get, our long-term care facilities, the last to get protective equipment or some of the testing. And so as we move to the new paradigm that the paper talks about, I think we have to build on the strength that we have, and also make sure that some of the mistakes that we made early on don't happen again.
Thanks, Julie. Ben, let me invite you to turn your camera and microphone back on. We have just about 5 minutes. That should be enough for 2 or 3 questions, I hope, or 2 or 3 comments. Why don't you share, Ben, something that's been striking you in terms of a comment or a question, and we'll just put a question to any one of our 3 panelists.
Yeah, there's been a bunch of comments and questions coming in about the youth and the elderly. So let me just read two comments and questions, and then that have to do with that. So the first one is, with so much social isolation for the elderly, what programs are currently in practice bridging young children to the elderly? So many kids don't have any interaction with the elderly. And then this is the second one. We rightly talk about reconnecting seniors with their community or with the younger generation. What can we do to prevent the disconnect from happening in the first place?
Okay, I can't see my 3 colleagues' screens, so let me ask one of you if you just want to jump in. Please do so.
I can give one example, Chris. We have a facility called the Mount in the Seattle area, where in this long-term care facility, and it's pretty traditional nursing home, they co-locate a child daycare center. And I walked into it one day, and the children were in the pews taking a nap. And that was right after they had done storytelling with the older people. And it certainly enriched the lives of both those children in the daycare and also the residents in that nursing home.
Okay. Paula, I think you were citing a ministry, an activity where elders were teaching English to immigrant children, did you?
Yes, I did, certainly. And I'm glad when I heard of this, in fact, child care in nursing home, I was very glad. And also, for example, we have a tutoring program in New York for children. And part of the program was to visit the elderly in nursing home once a month. So they will just go there and spend time with them. So I think there are always that we can encourage that encounter among generations.
Great. Ben, you have something else for us?
Yeah, there was a comment and question that came in, actually came in twice, and this is it. I have been concerned all along during the pandemic about seniors in various facilities having to die alone without the presence of loved ones. Does the church have any leverage in this area to advocate for seniors as loved ones being given more access to them? Even though the CDC issued new guidelines yesterday, it was emphasized that these do not apply to seniors living in senior care institutions.
Well, I think, Ben, that long-term care providers recognize that loneliness has been one of the worst side effects of this pandemic. And we have had very strict rules that have come from HHS, from CDC and other people about visitation. And many facilities have been extremely creative. I think Monsignor Bolin was talking about the creativity of trying to make sure, whether it's electronically or using ladders to help family members reach the top floor where their seniors were. But I think the person who asked the question is exactly right.
Ben, do you have a third for us?
I have a third.
Okay.
This is a question that came in. It's how do we address the false expectations among the elderly to prolong life with the advanced technologies in medicine, but depriving quality of fruitful and joyful living?
Can I jump in, Chris?
Please.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of the contradictions. It must be an issue that, on which we should reflect more, because I think there is still joy of living. I've seen many elderly also in bed for many years and also alone, suffering in a way physically, but then enjoying also the company. I think that there is something cultural to be changed, that happiness is not in the things we do, in the running, in the activity, but there is also happiness in being, and in being together, in the presence, in enjoying one another presence. And I think that has been a joy all along in the visiting also with the elderly friends. And I think they teach us that. And it's a value that also among younger generation is good to be rediscovered. I mean, enjoying one another presence. And this is what I also has been missing so much during the pandemic.
Okay, maybe I will move us toward conclusion, because I was given instruction that we really want to hit the 1 hour mark, and I think we're going to be able to do that for everybody. So first of all, let me thank all our panelists and the Archbishop and Father Charlie for all the help they've given us. And most importantly, let me thank all of you who signed in for your very robust participation. This is really what we hoped for and need. Let me make two or three comments. I see in the chat box, a lot of it had the feel of, what do we do? Like we're all on board. Now what do we do? And that's a wonderful spirit to see. And so let me remind you all that we do want to create a forum for raising ideas, sharing ideas. So please do email if you have some idea that you'd like to share with some of this community, please do so. So that's one thing I want to share as we wrap up. A second thing you'll see on the screen right now, our other 3 dates. So if you haven't registered for the whole series, please do so. A third comment, this seminar was recorded, and of course it's available and available free. If you want to use it for a resource with some of your own teams, if you want to invite others to look at it, if you want to invite others to be part of the next in the series, please do that. There's only about 200 or so of us, and we have to change a culture of more than 300 million people in the United States. So we may need 1 or 2 others along for this journey, even though we're off to a great start on our own. And then the last thing I will share is the reminder that we want to carry this conversation beyond us. And let me invite you maybe to do a prayerful or reflective reading of the source document, that Vatican document, if you hadn't read it, and then maybe share on social media some phrase that struck you, some idea that struck you, or something from today that you want to share on social media. And I'm going to ask my colleagues, Dottie or Kim, to remind us of some of these hashtags that might help us to prolong this conversation. Hashtags like hashtag Catholic Cares, or hashtag For Our Elders, or hashtag aging. Very last point, we're going to be invited to fill out a survey right now. We really want to listen to your feedback and heed it in these coming 3 webinars. So the link for that survey will come up momentarily, and we invite you to fill that out. And with that, let me declare us finished for today, but just beginning this journey we all want to make together. And thank you very much for your participation.
And with that, on behalf of the community of Sant'Egidio, Catholic Charities USA and the Catholic Health Association of the United States, I would like to thank you for participating in today's event. The recording will be emailed and will also be posted on CHA's website at chausa.org. Again, please take a moment to complete the survey by clicking the link in the chat box. Today's program is copyright 2021 by the Catholic Health Association with all rights reserved. This concludes today's program. Thank you and have a great day.